Hi, my name is Alex and welcome back to Magic Missile Minis. Today, I'm going to be teaching you guys how to make a Displacer Beast. I start this project by creating the armature, bending a piece of wire in half and then twisting it together to give it a little bit more structural support. For those of you who don't know what a Displacer Beast is, it's essentially like a six-legged puma with two large barbed tentacles coming out of its back. It's known for being able to teleport around, which is part of the reason it's called a Displacer Beast. Since Displacer Beasts are based off of pumas, I wanted to have him kind of crawling down a large piece of rock. So here I'm adding some cork to create a little bit of stone as if it's on the side of a mountain or something that's crawling down. With the cork in place, I start to bend the wire of the armature to create the hind legs of the miniature. My plan was to take these, and once they're in shape, to attach them to the cork by stabbing them into it, and that way it'll have a nice strong hold onto the base. After checking the armature to the cork, I rip a little bit of the cork off to create footholds for the miniature before doing exactly that, stabbing it into the cork so that it has a nice strong hold to the base of the mini. The next step is to start adding all the other parts of the armature. I start with the tail, putting a little loop in the end of a piece of wire, wrapping that around the main part of the armature, and keeping it in place with some superglue. I repeat the process for the arms, finding that I generally need to use one piece of wire for both sets of arms, since this guy's going to have 4. I also add an extra piece of cork here that I'm going to use as a third point of contact for the miniature, having this arm piece also be stabbed through that so that I have another point of contact and the miniature will just be a lot more stable as I'm working on it. Once I've posed the armature, I can start adding green stuff. This first layer I try to keep especially thin. That way I don't have to worry about it peeking through or being the wrong shape as I add all of the details. This miniature I was kind of hoping to keep very spindly and skinny and kind of alien. So making sure this first layer of green stuff is especially close to the wire was really important. The first detail I decided to add was the rib cage. To keep this miniature from looking just like a puma with 6 legs, I wanted it to make a little bit creepier and eerier, and so like I had mentioned earlier, I was going to make it very skinny, and to do that, I need to make sure that most of the skeleton is fairly visible. So here you can see I start adding some of the ribs that you can see through the skin. My favorite interpretation of D&D monsters is when, rather than simply having them look exactly like a puma with 6 limbs or whatever, I like the idea of if somebody saw it, they would describe it as a puma with 6 limbs and 2 barbed tentacles, and then an artist would draw that as literally a puma with exactly that. But when you see them in person, I want it to look not quite like a puma. You know, I want it to be a little bit more interesting, a little bit more alien and different, so you could see how somebody would describe it that way, but it's not exactly that, the way that a lot of fantasy creatures are described. So for the body of this guy, it almost ended up looking a little bit more like a greyhound. With the main part of the body finished, I started working on the limbs. The order that I did some of the arms didn't really make much sense, but I started anyways by adding the shoulder muscles onto the front set of limbs. Planning on starting there for all of the limbs, but then I got a little carried away and just started working on the leg and finished that. So here you can see I had a large piece of green stuff for the thigh and tried to do a little bit of detailing to imply some of the different muscle groups there, so it's not just a big blob of green stuff for a leg. After working a little bit on that, I had another piece of green stuff onto the second part of the leg. Here, I wanted to be very visible that there's 2 separate bones, the way that any leg would be, having that distinction be really, really clear. And then I add a little blob of green stuff onto the bottom for the paws of the mini. Because of the scale of this miniature, I didn't have to worry too much about the individual toes of the paws being too detailed. I could generally put little slits in, and that worked. I then repeat the entire process for the other leg, and then decided I wanted to start working on the barbed ends of the tentacles. My idea for the barbed parts of the tentacles was less that it would just be a bunch of spikes, but more so they could kind of curl in and get splayed out whenever he would swing them. So I create this kind of flat section that would almost act as this little pocket or indentation where the barbs would curl in on themselves. For this one, especially I wanted it to be curled in on this side, and the other one I would have it be a little bit more wide and open so that all of these spikes would be splayed out a little bit. I don't know, I thought it was a little bit more interesting than just throwing a bunch of spikes at the end of a tentacle. Moving on to the arms, I finally end up finishing those guys, doing essentially the same thing that I did for the legs, but just on a much smaller scale. Here, emphasizing the different bones and muscles and trying to look spindly and kind of weird. Rather than using a needle, I take this kind of knife tool to put in all the detailing for the fingers of the paws. The next step was to work on the head. So I start by adding a piece of green stuff that's going to act as the quote-unquote skull for this miniature. Just putting it in general place and trying to create a semblance of the shape that I want for the head. After that, I go ahead and put the eyeballs on there, just having these little half circles of green stuff that are going to be surrounded later by the eyelids to make them look right. While that's setting, I can start putting all of the barbs into the ends of the tentacles. Here you can actually kind of see what I was meaning with the certain tentacles being kind of folded in on themselves, and then for the other ones, you can see that they get a little bit more splayed out. While the head is still setting, I decided I also wanted to add some veins onto the mini. I felt like this especially would push the alien, creepy nature of this monster. This would also help fill out this space here on the side of the monster that was just very kind of plain and empty. So I just take some thin noodles of green stuff and loosely blend them into the body of the miniature. I then just go around and repeat the process a couple times to make sure that there's a handful of them around the rest of the miniature as well. With that finished, I start working on the head of the miniature. Here, as per usual, I start with the brows so I can start thinking about the expression of the miniature a little bit. I have a photo pulled up of a Displacer beast that has a kind of puma-ish head, so that's kind of what I'm using to figure out what this monster's head is supposed to look like. I then take a little bit more green stuff and do both the jawline and the under part of the eye. I didn't want to have this monster's mouth open. I've made a lot of monsters with their mouths open, and so I kind of wanted to have this guy's mouth closed. Here, after adding a little bit on both sides, I can start teasing out the snout of this mini with the excess green stuff from the ends of the jawline. Part of the reason I liked the art that I was basing this off of was because there was something almost like serpentine about it. Again, pushing the kind of alien, almost Puma-ish, not quite vibe to it. So hopefully you can kind of see that influence of it. Almost looks a little bit snake-like rather than looking exclusively like a Puma's face. I then add a little bit more green stuff onto the bottom of the face so I can start making the lower jaw. And part of the way that I made it look very serpentine was I made the jaw go very far along the head. You can see, and that makes it look very, very snake-like rather than like a cat or something that would have the mouth be fairly far forward. Having the jaw push all the way back really helps make it look kind of alien and creepy. I blend all that green stuff into the neck and then start adding some ears for the mini. This was specifically very cat-like. I wanted to make sure that this just had that kind of Puma-ish thing, having both of the ears pushed back in the very like angry cat way. And I think that looks really cool. It is part of the reason somebody would look at it and be like, oh, that's definitely a weird looking cat. Here I add a little bit more green stuff to finish up the snout. This is the actual nose part of it. This especially is going to push the very cat-like nature of the creature's face. I use a needle to add all the tiny details like his nostrils. With all of that done, I then add some teeth. For this guy, I wanted to actually have 2 sets of fangs on either side. So I take a tiny little piece of green stuff and push that into shape with my needle. With that last detail finished, I start finishing up the base with a little of AK Interactive's Dark Terrain. Again, I love this texture paint. It really helps make the whole process of basing miniatures 100 times easier. So I go around the entire miniature, filling up any gaps and any place that needs a little bit of texture with this paint, and this is what the final sculpt looks like. I'm really happy with this, and I'm excited to see what this looks like with a layer of paint on it. So without further ado, let's get on to the painting section of the video. To prime the miniature, again, I'm using a airbrush paint that I'm just applying with a paintbrush because I don't have a rattle can or an airbrush, and I add 2 thin coats of that over the entire miniature. I then make sure to go over everything with a base coat of Vallejo Model Colors Black, and then I start highlighting, mixing that same black with Vallejo Model Colors Azure. I haven't actually painted black before, so this is kind of a fun challenge. It's always very weird to paint either white or black because they're kind of known for being a little bit weird to paint because, well, I can't shade black because that's the darkest paint I'm already using. So generally speaking, especially for something like a Puma or something with fur, I added the blue to create this base highlight around the entirety of the miniature, the same way that I would with anything else, starting with a dark color and then adding a little bit of lighter, except that I probably won't go nearly as light as I normally would. For most of this miniature, I used wet blending, so I just add both the dark paint and then a little bit of the lighter paint, and before they dry, mixing them together that way. Once I go over the entirety of the miniature, I take a little bit of this Model Colors buff, and I start doing the teeth and the barbs of this mini. Later on, I'm going to touch these guys up with a little bit of a dark brown wash to make them a little bit darker and add a little bit more interest to the color. For the eyes, I take some of this Vallejo Model Color Flat Red and Yellow Ochre to create a kind of red-orange glow. Here you can see my hair getting in the way of the camera, but I start with a very deep, dark red, adding a little bit of yellow to it every single time I do a layer. I do about 3 or 4 passovers of this to make sure that it's a bit of a gradient. At this scale, you don't need to worry about blending it too much. To get the actual eyes of it, I end up with this one bright, pure yellow ochre right towards the front of the eye rather than the middle of the eye relative to itself, because otherwise he looks a little cross-eyed. So making sure that the lightest part of the eye is facing forward, make sure that it actually looks like he's looking forward and his eyes are aligned. Here I'm adding the brown wash that I had mentioned earlier, and then for the veins that I had added, I mix in a little bit of purple with the dark blue paint that I had used earlier and blend that out to create this kind of pulsing effect and make them stand out a little bit more. I decided that I also wanted the tentacles to have the same purple rather than being the blue of the rest of the mini. In order to highlight it and make that highlight a little bit more interesting, I use the same azure to brighten up the purple paint rather than using a white, and it creates this really great little like bruised, almost very natural feel to the miniature. I also thought it would be cool to add that same effect to the very tip of the tail. In order to finish up painting the base, I take some of this flat brown, mixing various amounts of black paint into it to create a kind of varied earthy texture. Going over that with a pitch black wash to get in all of the crevices and cracks from the texture paint, and then finishing up the miniature with a dry brush. I'm really proud of this guy. I think he looks really cool. I really like the color scheme. I think the purple into the blue of the tentacles especially is something I'm really proud of. I think it looks very natural for this kind of monstrous creature. Overall, I think it looks very Puma. I was hoping to make it look more alien than it already is, but I'm still quite pleased with it. But thank you guys so much for watching this video. Don't forget to like, subscribe, do all the things. Check out my band. Here is one of our songs.
I'll make a room for you. I'll paint it black, white, and blue. Copper night. I'll make a room for you.
Also, I'm going to be opening an Etsy shop hopefully soon where you'll be able to buy the different miniatures that I make on this channel and order commissions. And I'm also hoping to start up my Patreon again. I know I did that a little while back and it didn't work very well. I've got a slightly better idea of how to approach that now. So be on the lookout for that in the next coming week. But either way, thank you guys so much for watching this video, and I hope to see you guys in the next one.
Copper and light.